All right. Good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this event of our Author Spotlight program. We are going to be discussing a very significant literature in transitional justice titled Things, Sympathy, A Strategy to Thinking Transitional Justice. That was authored by Professor Joanna Quinn of the Western University in Ontario. We have two able professors here to also help us shed more light on the book. Professor Elizabeth King from New York. Good to see you. I hope it's not too early to bring you on board. Yeah, I'm Professor Eric House. I'm sorry if I didn't that. Yeah, correctly. But it's good to see you both, and thank you for joining us. Just a bit of an information regarding our author. We would like to apologize that she is not here at the moment, and we wish her quick and speedy recovery from. I don't know whether you can still hear me. Can somebody confirm if you can hear me? Okay. Yeah. So I was just saying that our author is medically indisposed at the moment, so she won't be featuring live. Yeah, that's the correct word to use. But she sent in her thoughts, you know. She's on the book to you know, addition. Transitional Justice is a center that is designed to bridge the gap between the research and practice of transitional justice along the West African corridor and of course globally, as you can see with the caliber of people that have been on our panels and have made presentations at our center. So we're looking to, you know, bridge this divide between the practice and research, which we have noted within our own West African corridor has been a major challenge in terms of implementation of this mechanism. So we bring scholars together, come and discuss their ideas, as well as practitioners, so that we'll be able to make evidence-based or evidence-informed interventions in terms of transitional justice. So on this note, I welcome all of you to today's program. We promise you a very exciting time for the event. So I would like, I've introduced our panelists, able personalities in the field. So I would resume now by sharing my screen to play the presentation.
My name is Joanna Quinn, and I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and director of the Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Reconstruction at Western University. And it's my real pleasure to be able to talk to you today about some of the work that I'm doing. After genocide and other serious human rights violations, people need justice. They may have lost their husbands or daughters, they may have lost their homes, and even if they don't bear the physical scars of war, they bear the psychological scars. But what happens when no one will take those harms seriously? What happens when the rest of society turns its back? My work aims to flip that switch to make societies care. And what I want to talk about for the next few minutes is a relatively new peace-building tool that I've been working on. The first stage of that study has just been published in a book called Thin Sympathy that's published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Now, the kind of justice that comes after the most serious crimes is called transitional justice. And people like me are interested in confronting the legacies of past human rights abuses and atrocities to build a stable, peaceful, and democratic future as part of a bigger project of peace building, which tries to deal with the many reasons that people fight in the first place and to support societies to manage their differences and conflict without resorting to violence. Now, transitional justice is just one piece of the post-conflict puzzle, and it needs to be carried out along other forms of peace building and development that will make communities whole again. After a peace agreement is signed, transitional governments often put in place mechanisms to allow for justice, whether criminal trials or reparations schemes, or even truth and reconciliation commissions like the one we've had here in Canada to deal with the residential schools question. But if people don't know enough about what happened during the conflict, and here I'm talking about outsiders to that conflict, maybe people who live in different regions or people who haven't themselves been affected by it, there's a strong chance that they won't be in favor of the kinds of interventions that people who have been affected most need. Now, exactly that happened in Colombia in 2016, when voters went to the polls to legitimize the peace agreement in a plebiscite that would have ended the 52-year conflict between the government and the FARC. The plebiscite posed just one question: do you support the final agreement to end the conflict and build a stable and lasting peace? As you know, in a stunning upset, the no side prevailed. That plebiscite failed because just over 50% of voters voted against it. Now, the result revealed a sharp disconnect between those who had been affected by the conflict and wanted peace and who were willing to settle for less than perfect transitional justice programs to help with their own post-conflict transition, and those who had not, many of whom didn't understand the extent to which certain regions of the country had suffered disproportionately from the FARC conflict. Now, the result demonstrated that there was no uniform experience of the long conflict across the country. It also revealed a basic lack of understanding of the experiences of the other. And it was clear from the outcome that people living in one part of Colombia had vastly different concerns from people living in other areas of the country. Now, despite their relative proximity, for example, to one of the hardest hit regions, Chocó, the people in the neighboring department rejected the peace agreement altogether. If there had been an appreciation of what people living in the different conflict zones had experienced, though, or what their needs were, would the plebiscite have succeeded? Perhaps. And the Thin Sympathetic project, my work, is about making those other people care. Now, I've proposed a hypothesis that suggests that the development of even a very rudimentary understanding among individuals from each of the different factions and groups about what has happened, that is, the basic facts about the other's suffering, could be the necessary condition in promoting not just peaceful coexistence, but society's ability to move forward together. Surprisingly, though, that kind of understanding is too often missing from the post-conflict equation. Getting past that knowledge gap could allow different groups within the population to at least understand why something like transitional justice might be necessary. I want to be clear, though, what I'm proposing is actually far from ideal. In fact, it's the thinnest possible response, the building of basic understanding and basic awareness. And in my view, it's often the best we can hope for, a basic understanding of what others have gone through. I've called this thin sympathy, and I need to stress here that sympathy does not mean I feel sorry for you, but instead I'm using it to refer to recognition that others have experienced deeply traumatic violence and harm. Now, as I understand it, interventions to build this kind of understanding can make processes of transitional justice work better. Thin sympathy acts as a kind of lubricant that can make that happen by giving the population as a whole a basic understanding about what's happened so that they ultimately understand why transitional justice processes are needed for affected populations. There's often very little political support for things like trials and truth commissions to bring justice to that portion of the population. And instead, people hold tightly to ideas that are simply not true, and nothing gets done. My work is about making those other people care. And the first step, and the most important one, is giving them information and details about what has taken place. While that might seem like the easiest thing in the world, when many years of propaganda has told the population that the person on the other side is an animal, or that they've brought the genocide on themselves, it can be an uphill battle. We need to effectively win the hearts and minds of people to change those minds. They need to see that the people on the other side are human beings just like them, and that they've suffered and need a hand. This can be done through things like student exchanges or even everyday news broadcasts, updating school curriculum, or even television and radio dramas. But it's important that the information be delivered by a trusted, authoritative source. That same principle is now being used by governments as they try to persuade the Canadian public to get a vaccination against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Superstars like Ryan Reynolds are being pressed into service to convince people that the vaccination is safe and that they should get one too. The same principles of social psychology apply, whether populations are being persuaded to get a vaccine or to appreciate that their neighbor is a human being too. But they have to be deliberate interventions that we undertake, because leaving it to chance is too risky. The result of just a basic amount of knowledge about the other can in fact be life-changing. It breaks down biases and stereotypes, and even that small level of knowledge can, through a process called cognitive dissonance that was first outlined by Festinger, cause them to change their minds. The most unexpected thing that I have discovered is that people don't need to be what we might think of as all the way converted as champions for victims of war. It's enough for them to know the basics so that they'll support the creation of things like trials and truth commissions when the opportunity comes up. That basic amount of knowledge can be enough to ensure that the victims of war and genocide finally get justice. Of course, the more we can get the timing right for these kinds of interventions, the better they will work. It won't come as any surprise that building this kind of thin sympathetic understanding before a conflict takes place is relatively easy to do. When the risk is low and when they don't feel threatened, people can fairly easily be persuaded about the humanity of the other. Those kinds of upstream efforts are ideal. And that's the finding of one part of this study that I carried out with Summer Al-Masri and Tammy Lambert, and which was published in a book that looked at the preconditions for transitional justice success. We were trying to understand the dynamics that are at play in changing existing structures to make transitional justice more successful. Now, our book looked at how those contextual factors could be adjusted before processes of transitional justice are established. And we concluded that the transitional context could be ameliorated to create the conditions that would produce more robust and sticky results. That is, the earlier the better. Building thin sympathy is one of those preconditions, and doing the work of thin sympathy ahead of other processes should make those other processes work better. But it often happens that these kinds of interventions get lost in the shuffle, as biases and stereotypes give way to increasing levels of conflict. Still, it's not too late even at that point to attempt to do these things. Downstream interventions, even after conflict has broken out, either during the conflict or after the cessation of conflict, or even as transitional justice processes are rolling out, can also be successful. Thin sympathetic interventions could even be undertaken after a transitional justice mechanism has wrapped up, if thin sympathy hasn't been substantiated in the population. And much as it is now being predicted that to be protected from COVID, we're all going to need booster shots over the coming months and years, I think the same is likely to be true of thin sympathetic interventions. It probably needs to be done more than once as a kind of preventative against the recurrence of conflict. Now, the first part of the Thin Sympathy project was based on more than 20 years of work that I've done in Uganda. And I carried out fieldwork there in 2014, 15, 16, and 17 that focused explicitly on understanding the role of thin sympathy and on documenting grassroots efforts to build this kind of understanding. But as a Canadian, and in particular as a white settler scholar, I've also been puzzling through whether and how the thin sympathetic hypothesis could also apply here and in other settler colonial contexts, where there is no sign of a transition, but where violence and harm, structural violence, are essentially baked into the system, which was designed as a sort of zero-sum game where Indigenous people lose and the settlers take all. Now, the harms in settler colonial contexts are often quite different from conventional transitions and often include, for example, things like the dispossession of land or the extinguishment of rights pertaining to the use of that land, things like hunting and fishing, and being declared extinct as a people. But the radically different treatment of Indigenous people living across what we call Canada, for example, remains largely invisible to most other people living in those places. They are able to remain unaware of its destructive tentacles simply because it doesn't apply to them. The thin sympathetic hypothesis and engagement in thin sympathetic activities shows exceptional promise in its ability to break through the silos and stereotypes. It could usefully be a program of transformation. It seems that thin sympathetic interventions, engagement in thin sympathetic activities, shows exceptional promise in its ability to break through the silos and stereotypes, and it could usefully be employed as part of a broader program of transformation. It seems that thin sympathetic interventions in settler colonial contexts stand to make an even more significant contribution. Now, again, thin sympathy involves the deliberate building of understanding, awareness, recognition, and appreciation about what has taken place within single communities and in different communities across the country. In other types of conflict and post-conflict settings, overt violence is easy to see, and as a result, it's easy to establish the facts of that abuse and to understand what took place. In settler colonial contexts, though, connecting those dots is much harder to do. In both contexts, then, a campaign to build thin sympathy can be an effective part of the transition of peace-building toolbox. The benefits of thin sympathy are amplified if that kind of process is undertaken prior to the establishment of any transitional justice process, because giving the people the opportunity to know and understand what took place, rather than leaving it until after a Truth Commission has made its final report, for example, can be a useful device that could change the broader social ethos and establish effective preconditions for the ultimate success of those mechanisms, even before any kind of mechanisms like this are put in place. And to engage in processes of transformation.
Thank you very much for your patience and understanding. I hope you can hear me still. Okay, yeah, thank you. We've just listened to the presentation by the author, who is trying to start us off, with discussion on our theory of thin sympathy and how this can better enhance the implementation of transitional justice. And I think she's recalling us from our focus on the macro dimensions of interventions, where we think that the mega things that we do, the big projects that we do, the policies, the high-level engagements are what matters, in terms of implementation. But I think she's leading us to what we often ignore, the basics of trying to build legitimacy, using the word in a very broad sense, within the population for whom we are going to be making these interventions. And she's looking at, of course, the age of information dissemination with digital age, how easy that would be. In this age, we have a lot of persons that have turned into influencers in terms of their profession based on how the society recognizes them. and how this has been deployed in the COVID situation, and how this can also be applied continuously with the transitional justice processes. Without much ado, I'll hand over the platform to Professor King to give us our own intervention. Professor King, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Can I just get a wave or something to signify that you can hear me? Yes, okay, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here today, and I want to start off by thanking Professor Quinn for writing this really engaging and important book, and to all of you for meeting to discuss its ideas today. I'd also, of course, like to convey my wishes for well-being to all of you and to Professor Quinn, Joanna in particular. As you just heard, this book makes the case, and I'm sorry, someone is saying that the audio is not clear. Let's see if there's anything that we can do about that. Is there anyone else for whom the audio is not clear? It's coming in a little choppy. I appreciate that many of you have already turned off your cameras. However much I would love to see you because of the connectivity issues. How is it going? How is it going now? Some are saying not clear. Philip, can I look to you for guidance? Philip? I can reconnect to the audio.
Sorry.
Let me see.
Yeah.
How is that now? Is that any improvement? I've connected through a different microphone. Perfect, says Phil. Oh, this is very exciting news. All right. Thank you for your patience, everyone. And if there's a positive takeaway from COVID, I hope it is that we all have much more patience with one another as we struggle to communicate and take the advantages too of these opportunities to communicate across space. So I was just, beginning, of course, with my thanks and my well wishes for all of you. And maybe just to reflect, as we all just heard from Professor Quinn, that this book makes the case that thin sympathy is a precondition for successful transitional justice. And in my opinion, this is a really simple yet useful and original concept. Quinn means that thin sympathy is this development of a basic understanding among individuals from each of the different factions and groups of what has happened, of the basic facts of the other's suffering. And she posits simply that not knowing blocks people's understandings for the other and for why transitional justice is needed. I think the argument is original, it's important. It's also, to me, refreshingly realistic as compared to arguments that would say that it's something like deep empathy or forgiveness that's required for society to move forward. That these things, I think, are unlikely to be attainable in conflict-affected contexts. So with Joanna's concept of thin sympathy, I think she is striving for more obtainable goals, understanding, awareness, recognition, appreciation. But as I'll elaborate in my comments, I think they're not easy to achieve either, and they're still quite ambitious. So for me, having had the chance to read this book some time ago and refreshing myself this week, I easily bought into the concept, bought into this idea that thin sympathy was important and promising as priming for transitional justice. And I even went further in my reading that it could be a contributor to reconciliation. Thin sympathy might be a deterrent to future conflict. And I've already cited the book to many, recommended it to many other scholars. So leaving with this reading that thin sympathy, hard to say, but a great idea, I wanted to know, okay, so how do you do it? And that's where I'll center my comments. Quinn has 2 chapters in the book that get at what she says the actual work of cultivating thin sympathy and how it can be carried out. And in particular, she has a chapter called Manufacturing Thin Sympathy, where she focuses on everyday ways to cultivate thin sympathy, cultural diplomacy, and what she calls entertainment education. And she focuses on ideas, in the book at least, that are absent this state. And she looks at efforts that people can make at local level, at the regional level, and at national levels. Now, in her comments that we just heard, she goes beyond these and suggested some additional ideas, some ways that we might build thin sympathy. And she included this state in a number of the ideas that she just spoke about. So building on both of these things, let me please share some thoughts and questions. I have 4 in particular that build off this excitement about the idea of thin sympathy, and that also build off my own work that focuses on conflict, peace building, and oftentimes education. So first, one of my passions within this general sphere of peace building is education. And the book largely focuses on informal education, that is taking place outside of schools. Much of my work, though, is actually on formal schooling. And I'm interested in understanding the power and the promise of schooling, of education. And while acknowledging that it's not automatic, schools could have a very important role to play in the cultivation of thin sympathy. And in the remarks that Professor Quinn just made in the recording, she did note updating the school curriculum as a potential avenue to thin sympathy. And here I strongly agree. Quinn writes that community members need to, and I quote, identify and accept shared narratives of what has taken place. And I would argue that schooling is probably the key mechanism to inculcate a shared narrative among a population. In previous work, for instance, I studied the teaching of history and historical memory in Rwanda. And right now, I'm actually working on a project with funders, implementing partners, and the Ministry of Education in Liberia to reintroduce civic education. Now, in focusing on the power and the promise of schooling, I also want to problematize it. So my first book was called From Classrooms to Conflict in Rwanda. And it takes on the assumptions that schooling and the narratives that are taught therein necessarily contribute to peace, which is how we like to talk about schools and how we're talking about it in terms of thin sympathy. And I also, in that book, investigate the ways in which education might contribute to conflict. So it's not automatic that a narrative taught in schools cultivates thin sympathy, but I think it's a really important place that merits further investigation and conversation. And I would be very interested to hear what you all think about the possibility of schooling in playing this important role in the, using Professor Quinn's word, manufacturing or the cultivation of thin sympathy. Let me now move, if I may, to my second point. Another theme that has to do with this goal of, and Quinn writes, get all members of the society on the same page. So here I was thinking about this idea and the varied starting places at which different people in a population would find themselves, and efforts to cultivate thin sympathy that meets people where they are. So let me please elaborate with an analogy. I have a 10-year-old daughter who is in 5th grade, and her teacher tries to teach new knowledge, right? And that's kind of the goal of thin sympathy. But as a classroom teacher, that teacher needs to think carefully about where the different students are at. So imagine you're a math teacher. You might do a quiz at the beginning of the year to see where the baseline is. right? You might have wanted to teach complex algebra, but you know that before you can do that, students need to have a strong understanding of, say, multiplication. So as a teacher, you might notice that some students already have a little understanding of the basics, some none at all. Others already have an advanced grasp, and perhaps still others might have parents who taught them that algebra is useless. So while I could talk about my daughter all day, let's move away from the analogy that I think is a compelling one, though, to think about peace building and reconciliation and maybe transitional justice. And it would be interesting for me to hear more about where people's starting point is. And with this goal of thin sympathy, of getting all the members on the same page, thinking about strategies that acknowledge the variation in starting points and beliefs that might inform these strategies. Now, my third point builds on these first two as well. And here I'm interested in a question of timing and sequencing. And an additional point that Quinn noted in her opening remarks about this learning and knowledge needing to happen more than once. So early in the book, when Quinn is making the case for thin sympathy, she writes, and I quote, "One can imagine a government official saying to donors, please give us another 6 months before you start a truth commission or put a truth commission in place so we can make the process stronger and more useful." And her logic is that you need thin sympathy before traditional transitional justice mechanisms like trials, truth commissions, reparations, amnesties. So here's my question, though, about timing and sequencing. It also seems like developing thin sympathy is quite a long-term undertaking, especially that people are all at different starting points. And so 6 months seems to me in that remark to be quite unrealistic. Now, with this goal of getting all members on the same page too, it's probably too big to say all members, but some are better than none. And it seems that there would be a core that would be required to move forward with support for transitional justice. So one of my questions is then, what is the tipping point when you have enough people with basic, thin, sympathetic understanding to move forward towards transitional justice? I think too, in thinking about timing and sequencing, there's somewhat of a chicken and egg problem. That is, you need enough thin sympathy to put some of these efforts into practice. You need some political will, even if it's not a state-led initiative. But at the same time, it's iterative. So you need the thin sympathy or some of it to start the thin sympathetic manufacturing initiative, to then cultivate thin sympathy. I will not go on with this. I'm getting myself confused, but there is some circularity to what's happening here. And we need to think, if we're thinking strategically, how do you do this? There's certainly questions about timing, sequencing, repetition, tipping points, population. So let me, looking at the time, please just say my brief comment number 4, thought number 4 about how we do this. And this is probably a question to the author, but again, with your varied experience, we all might be able to weigh in. My reading was that the principal way to do thin sympathy, to build thin sympathy, was through teaching people, right? And our host's remarks were helpful too in saying that it was this age of information dissemination, and it was influencers that could help teach people in a way that people might think of as legitimate. Professor Quinn, in her closing, talked about a campaign to build thin sympathy. So I wanted to understand how this idea of messaging works alongside or different to experiential learning, which Professor Quinn also talks about a number of times in the book, and in particular, the contact hypothesis. So many of you might be familiar with this idea of the contact hypothesis, that more contact between individuals belonging to antagonistic social groups tends to undermine negative stereotypes that they have of each other and can, under the right conditions, reduce mutual antipathies and improve intergroup relations. And we usually think about in-person contact, meeting, encountering people, talking, maybe playing sports. So it's through this experiential learning by doing, hands-on experiences that people learn about the other and could perhaps cultivate thin sympathy. And this is just a different pathway, a different way to do it, at least in my reading, than most of the strategies that Quinn is talking about, which are more about teaching people, whether it's through cultural diplomacy or edu-entertainment. So I would be very interested to think more about how these different kind of mechanisms, these different pathways to thin sympathy, and I challenge all of you to say thin sympathy 3 times back to back really fast, how these different pathways might support each other or merit more thinking about as promising. So to wrap up, let me again just say thank you to Professor Quinn for writing such a thought-provoking book. And you can see I was interested and excited to get to the work. Like, okay, so how do we do it? Let's talk strategy. So let me thank you so much for the opportunity to share those thoughts with you. And I leave it to you to give me lots of really good answers.
Thank you very much, Professor Quinn. I'm sure that during our engagement with the audience, we're going to exchange ideas and see what are the better ways. Just for a quick recap of what you said, of course, just to go straight to your 4 points, the first thing about education and its importance. And of course, I love the fact that you mentioned your own intervention on how education as a neutral value, it could either be used to build peace or used to enhance conflict based on the Rwandan experience. Also, the second thing of trying to get all the members of the societies engaged. So how do you create like a national narrative? This has also been our own challenge. We want to recall, for instance, the Nigerian Civil War. There are different narratives that we have from different parts of the country, the North, the South, which has found the embers of hatred among members of these different ethnic groups, simply because we do not have a national narrative. So you have a lot of isolated authors, and there has not been a political will to come out to say that, okay, as a nation, this is how we want to tell our story, and this is how to move forward. I was talking with an old person yesterday in his 80s who experienced the war, and he was telling me about how he had to feed the chicken of an Igbo person in the Midwest. He's from the Southwest. If he had to take care of the poultry farm of an Igbo person who had to relocate during the war. So we don't get to hear these little micro narratives. We're always focusing on the soldiers, the Asaba massacre, and this other stuff. Where there are people that collected rents. When you're talking about taking care of the investments of people who had to relocate based on the war situation at the moment. So I agree that how do you create a legitimate narrative, based on the variation of beliefs that exist within this different context. The other one, which has to do with the timing and sequencing. How long is it? In fact, how long is it appropriate for us to implement a transitional justice mechanism? Which do you go for? Amnesty? Do you go for criminal prosecution? So how do you even sequence this to make them make sense within each national context? Of course, we know that we have to contextualize them, but the arbitrariness of this implementation end up making them not as important as they're supposed to be. And your final point in terms of messaging, moving from the formal educational system to experiential learning, which I don't think is foreign to us when we talk about our own African context of learning, So, well, we believe basically that it's important that the home becomes the first point of education, for children growing up. And this could, parents could leverage on it. So how do we even educate the parents to start this basic level of education, within the families? Just to mention that since we're talking about the digital age and influencing at the moment, what has happened within the digital context? I mean, if you could see, I'm in a hotel room, so I had to step out of a book launch event, today. And the idea of it, one of the interventions from the panelists was the fact that the digital age has decentralized authority in terms of knowledge. So a 10-year-old may have access to information more than somebody who is in the 80s. Ab initio, the age was very significant when you talk about authority. So you look at professors in the university that are irreplaceable because of their years of experience, their wealth of knowledge. But you discover now that when you want to even teach in class, people you're trying to, speak with have some kind of information, perhaps current, that you may not even be aware of. So how do we balance this new emergence of knowledge production and dissemination within these different contexts? So thank you very much, Professor King, for stimulating us in this direction. Sorry, Professor Eric, let me just use your first name. I think that's okay. I'm not taking your place, so please, I'm adding over the platform to you to give us your own intervention. Thank you very much.
And Philip, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. Thanks for all of you who are here, and to echo Professor King, thank you to Dr. Joanna Quinn for writing this insightful book that's brought us all together here today. I'm going to do three things, and I think some of the themes that I'm going to draw on are going to, I think, cross paths and with issues that Dr. King had raised earlier. But I think I'll come at them from a slightly different angle. So I'm going to do three things. Well, first is I want to start with an anecdote, a local anecdote. Here I'm in Arkansas in the United States. And then I want to reflect on the broader significance of Dr. Quinn's book, and then come back to what I see are some of the most important theoretical and policy questions that her work gives rise to. So hopefully that can serve as an inspiration for, and I think this book should serve as an inspiration for a lot of future research, both by Dr. Quinn and others. So let me start with a little bit about things here in Arkansas. So for the past 5 years or so, I've been working with local activists who are trying to prompt really transitional justice processes here in the state to deal with histories of racial violence here in Arkansas. So, until recently, few people, like the term transitional justice is, until like the last year or two, has not been a part of the discourse in policy circles here in the United States, or among activists. Though again, that's changed, but it's still relatively new. What these activists have sought to do over the past few years are multiple things. They've pursued memorialization, so working with the Equal Justice Initiative, which has been working with communities across the country to, in particular, to memorialize victims of lynchings across the country. So that's been happening. There have been attempts to remember a famous race massacre that happened in the town of Elaine in southeast Arkansas in 1919. And the activists have also tried to push more of an official, state-led initiative to look into the past. So in 2019 and then again in 2021, legislation was introduced in the state legislature here in Arkansas that would, among other things, create a truth commission-like body that would investigate the history of racial violence in the state. In particular, it was focused on pre-civil rights era, so violence from the 1950s and earlier. And then the goal then with that the history, that official history that would come out of the Truth Commission would then inform, further efforts of memorialization, and as well as shape school curriculum here in the state. So those efforts, so the memorialization efforts, the lynching memorialization efforts are civil society led. Those things are moving forward. The legislative route, sort of going the official route, has been unsuccessful. Against the efforts started in late 2018, and so Dr. Quinn's book starts by like with the premise of wanting to understand why is it that transitional justice processes often stumble? Why is it they're not successful? And that seems to be and by transitional justice, the official steps. And we see this happening here in Arkansas, at least for the present. And so, again, as she talks about quite eloquently in the video that we've watched, this promise that the development of thin sympathy, or as she defines it, this basic understanding of the past, can be necessary. They're certainly not sufficient to create more durable transitional justice processes. So I promise I'll come back to that anecdote later and connect it to some of the questions that I have. So Dr. Quinn's work is important on theoretical and policy grounds. One of the things that's most powerful about it is that theoretically she weaves together a wide variety of strands in the transitional justice field, which has often been criticized for going in a thousand different directions. So, whereas much of the research that's out there focuses more on victims and survivors and perpetrators, she's drawing in, the comparatively unaffected part of the population. And so she also, in particular, kind of bringing in concepts from psychology, which again, that is not unprecedented in transitional justice research, but again, that this psychology research has tended to focus on survivors and perpetrators rather than the more general public, so to speak. She also, I think there are also really clear connections to research on civil society organizations and their role in transitional justice. Much of the research that's out there focuses on how those civil society organizations mobilize to try to prompt official action, like those official transitional justice processes. And so Dr. Quinn's book is shifting our focus to how civil society organizations can prime or ripen the circumstances to make those official processes more successful. So kind of going back further in the process of generating that that momentum. And lastly, and I guess I don't mean to suggest that there's not a lot of research looking at more non-official forms of transitional justice, by which I mean, those that are more driven by civil society and don't really engage the state, or step in when the state does not. But what Dr. Quinn's work does is get us to think about whether those non-official, unofficial civil society actions, that they may or may not produce the thin sympathy that she sees as so important. So more the focus is on what they instigated rather than its effects. Dr. Quinn's work, there are major policy implications of this. The stakes are very high in conflict-affected societies if transitional justice fails. There are lots of concerns about transitional justice process, maybe creating new grievances or refueling divisions. So this idea of investing in how we can ripen or prime circumstances to better assure that transitional justice processes are more successful is really important. So while so the book it draws on Dr. Quinn's very rich and long history of working in different contexts. The focus primarily on Uganda, but as she talks about in the video, also her research in Canada, and she's worked in many other places, Solomon Islands, for example, in Fiji as well, Haiti. So her rich experience of field work really comes into play here, and really suggests a future research. So the book is really conceptually compelling, and there are lots of anecdotes in there that suggest that that this could be a powerful step, to invest in sympathy. But then this gives rise to a whole host of research questions that are really important ones that should be pursued. One is, as somebody who's written and thought a lot about methodology and how we can use social science research methods to answer important policy questions around TJ. One of the things I think about is like how do we measure things? Like how do we know that it exists? How do we know that the time is now right to try something? And when do we act? And so to come back to my anecdote at the start, I'm not sure if thin sympathy exists in the United States. On one level, there are a few people that would reject or outright deny the racial violence that people of color have faced in the United States. There's certainly a level at which, particularly if we're talking about historical wrongs, there's a significant portion of the population that rejects the idea that those historical wrongs continue to shape our present. So I'm not sure if thin sympathy exists here in the United States. The second set of questions revolve around how does thin sympathy itself get cultivated, and this kind of connects to some of the comments that Professor King was talking about. If as was talked about in the video and in the book, education curriculum is so important in many places like that. That's an official thing as well. So it's another kind of chicken and egg problem. Like how do we develop enough momentum to change those educational curriculum, but then we'll develop broader thin sympathy in the population. Also raises questions, like again, kind of connecting it to issues around timing, is that the timing seems really, it's hard to predict when the time is right, and that window of opportunity, to take a term that Rebecca Root uses in talking about transitional justice in Peru, can be awfully narrow. So to come back to the example of Arkansas, in 2019, it actually seemed possible that the legislation could have passed, and from my observations, what ultimately doomed it was conflict among activists. So there were disagreements among them that then helped to at least provide cover for some members of the legislature to drop their support for the legislation. 2 years later, and I don't need to go into Arkansas legislative politics, but just if you're curious, the legislature here is not professional, and so the full legislature only meets every 2 years, and so that's why 2019 and then 2021 was the next time the legislation came up. Now, in 2021, the legislation, the draft legislation, long outcomes of the Truth Commission, the finding to inform educational curriculum. This is if you know, from a state legislature that's dominated by Republicans was a non-starter. So that was derailed for other reasons, and now it seems like that time has passed, at least for the near future. One is trying to identify more. And so I think for research, that she uses in the book primarily come from Uganda. Uganda in many ways is a tough case. It may be, some people argue that every case is different and that comparison is difficult, not impossible. I'm not one who feels that. How typical or atypical is Uganda. So we need more research then on doesn't happen. What examples are out there that work, and perhaps you who are here today are, do strategies, kind of local community effort, more diverse crowd. Okay, thanks for the notification. I'm going to notice that that you're not hearing me at all. I'll speak, hopefully I'll be done by then. So local level, they're broader. To have a couple of more minutes, that a question about scaling up is premised on the assumption that is even and I wonder if it seemed like implicit is the idea that ultimately we want to develop thin sympathy nationwide, but maybe that's not the case. To connect to the more about how to cultivate research question be things I wonder about is to what extent in deeply divided societies, to what extent are there trusted sources that can get this off the ground, particularly trusted sources than divides in society. So, for example, that we can point to about how and the last thing, and I hate to conclude but it seems like for the comments about greater that maybe creating some empathy or not present in the past. Sorry, I'm just I got a message about it being unstable, so I staggered for a second. Well, how digital media has really enabled information, false information, to be easily get more possible for counter against the development of things.
Oh,
I want to thanks and apologies for the disruptions with the audio.
no worries, Professor Wilberhouse Brown. We're very grateful for your very wonderful interventions. Well, we started today with a bit of technical itch. I'm hoping that in spite of this, we're going to have a very robust discussion. So I just sent in the chat that we could drop our questions in the chat box or raise our hands, but I'll just give a bit of summary of the parts that I caught in the last speaker's intervention. And I love the fact that it brought on a practical aspect of the work on racial justice in the US, for instance, which for me is something that is important because one of my first, not first, but one of the most important literature I think I've read on transitional justice is Andrew Val's Racial Justice as Transitional Justice, which I think is a very seminal piece when it comes about the incomplete nature of some of these processes, which is why we also have to look for ways in which we're going to, improve on the mechanisms and how, of course, we implement them. And I love the fact that you informed us that this literature or the text that we're exploring today is quite important, both in terms of theory and policy. Bringing the different strands of transitional justice together, its multidisciplinarity, intersecting psychological methods, or the methods of psychology within the framework of transitional justice, the focus on CSOs and their work on transitional justice, and how these are helping official processes in terms of, maximization of impact. You questioned the fact that how do we measure Think Sympathy, in terms of its impact? Does it exist? When do we act? Then how do we even implement it? When is the time for us, to develop these sympathies? Knowing that there are lots of historical wrongs that have happened that, help to shape the present, which makes the implementation of this process, a bit complicated. And what comes first, the political will of implementing these mechanisms or educating people in buying into this mechanism? You also mentioned the fact that how do we get trusted sources to help us, in implementing all of these strategies? I'm just a bit fascinated because I work in the development sector at the moment in terms of the roles of civil society organizations and transitional justice, which is also part of why we at the center are trying to look for ways of maximizing the impact of this intervention in Nigeria. As we all know, we've had over a decade of terrorist attacks, in Nigeria, which are spread over from the northeast to the northwest, and of course, is encroaching into the north central at the moment. And we have a lot of CSO interventions. Now, the challenge for me is, what brought me actually to the north as a professional was to try to help devise the transitional justice mechanisms for victims of Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast. And that was about 7 years ago. What I've noticed is that civil society organizations within the transitional justice space in Nigeria have kept repeating the same mechanism of town hall meetings, the radicalization interventions from imams, and even when it comes to securitization, these are things that crop up all the time. And we repeat the same events without actually, having, the kind of results that we desire. Perhaps we're dancing to the tones of funders and what they want us to do. So there is the challenge of making evidence-based interventions. When is the right time to start this transitional justice, which according to the literature in which transitional justice implementation, which according to the book we're reading, is when we have enough when we've garnered enough sympathy from members who are supposed to help us in ensuring that these interventions are sustainable. The other thing is also the allegations of corruption, which has become a very significant dilemma, undermining the impact of civil society organizations. So when the people you're supposed to build the thing sympathy within consider you as corrupt, when they think that you're depriving them of some of the aids that you've collected, or when the government itself is trying to bring in all sorts of bottlenecks, in terms of rules and regulation to ensure that there's a bit of sanity, within civil society space, then it becomes challenging for civil societies to carry out their roles appropriately, in terms of trying to build such needed thin sympathy, among the victims. So I think we've had very elaborate discussions about this. I think we have someone who wants to speak. Olaiwola Abidemi, please, can you give us your comment and question? Thank you.
Yes, thank you to the speakers for their insightful thoughts. However, my question is as closely related to Dr. Phillips' submission. And the primary one is on the issue of the timing, like what time is appropriate for transitional justice to take place? And also, does it have a sequence of activity that must happen like in stages of one before the other? And I'm linking that to, of course, the Nigerian situation of the Biafra war. Some have argued that the transitional justice thing to date has not been a success because of the delayed timing. And we then link it quickly to the activities of Boko Haram now. You see the radicalization, the conflict handling, and all of these things as a step in transitional justice. But many would argue that the theater of war is still brewing. So at what stage is it appropriate for transitional justice to commence? And are there stages that must be followed strictly, or each situation needs a particular transitional justice tailored to it in particular? So thank you if you would assist in shedding more light on this. Bye.
Thank you very much. Professor King, do you want to go first?
Sure, happy to give it a try. I was laughing because your question is one of the exam questions that I often give my students in Introduction to Peace and Conflict Studies as my way to avoid having to answer it and having a group of really smart students try to tackle it. And I usually phrase it a little bit differently. I usually talk about the pillars of peace building, right? Being security, political institutions, economic development, transitional justice, and reconciliation, and saying like, which one comes first? You have limited number of dollars, like how would you allocate? I phrase it a little bit differently each year. And then I think our speaker's comment also raised that, it's not just those things that need to be sequenced, but like in Joanna Quinn's book, within transitional justice, there are multiple steps, right? And her argument, and I wish she were here to make it, of course, but her argument is that this a cultivation of thin sympathy has to come before these other transitional justice activities like trials, truth commissions, reparations, etc. And I think both myself and my co-speaker today have raised some questions, right? Not answers that we would want to continue to discuss, though, about like, how do you know when you have enough? How do you know when you have enough thin sympathy or spread across a sufficiently large population or spread across key influencers from different groups, right? Like who would have to be representative of the broader population in order to start making those steps? And so I do not know the answer so much as to say it's a great question. And the additional piece that I would throw back to that comes from your comments, Mr. Oleyuko, is about youth, right? And so the demographics in the population are something that I wonder about too in answering this question. So in my first book on Rwanda, when I'm looking at education, I make that point that in Rwanda and in much of sub-Saharan Africa, upwards of 40% of the population is under the age of 15. And those kind of trends carry to many conflict-affected contexts, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka. I would have to look at the list. But so too, in thinking about not only the timing, but who are the key populations that you need to get on board to make a population, ripe for transitional justice. A lot of, and you were saying a lot of the digital access to information is for younger populations. I was making the case about school-based education. That's for younger populations, but that's not going to be adequate, right? As a broader representation of society as well to get thin sympathy before transitional justice. And maybe the last thing to say is that it clearly takes a long time in some countries. So like Professor Quinn, I'm Canadian. And so thinking about the references that she was making to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Canada right now for horrendous mistreatment of Indigenous populations that goes back, centuries into the 20th century and persisting, of course, that people are just starting to grapple with in both transitional justice mechanisms and I would argue in thin sympathy. So I'd say you're not alone in saying this question of it feels like a long time.
Professor Eric.
I agree. It's an important question and a really hard question to answer as well. And when I look at research in areas like on civil wars and that literature has gotten to a point where they've identified several indicators that make more likely that civil war is going to break out. There are these indicators that have been developed about states becoming failed states. So they're trying to predict when these things are going to happen. I guess theoretically, we might get there sometime. With respect to transitional justice, but I guess I'm a bit skeptical about that. And it's never going to be perfect predictors anyway. One of the things with respect to timing that I think this comes back to a comment that Philip made is, which is really important, is the role of donors. And so in many countries where, in many conflict-affected countries where transitional justice is being contemplated, it's in part being driven by foreign donors, again, primarily Western donors. So, so that what that means for timing is that for civil society organizations, for governments, in countries when they're deciding when is the time right to do to either cultivate thin sympathy or to do some sort of official transitional justice mechanism, they're undoubtedly partially thinking about, right now I can get the money from USAID or from some other organization, but maybe I don't 6 months from now or 2 years from now. So I think inevitably those kinds of calculations are going to come into play. I mean, one would hope, and I think one of the things that would be fantastic is for as I implied, at least toward the end of my comments, that if this book can launch a concerted research agenda, that then might help to convince donors about the value of investing in different kinds of activities that could develop thin sympathy rather than focusing on the more high-profile official kinds of things.
Yeah, thank you very much for that intervention. Just to mention that donors also have to submit their, they have to submit reports, they have to talk about impacts, and so they may not have the luxury of waiting for the time, because we have to cultivate things sympathy, and as it were, we don't even know how long it would take. And I think from Professor Quinn's argument, we're supposed to use thin sympathy as the basis of driving other interventions for transitional justice, which I think is very fundamental. But I think there may be a bit of light in how to do this in terms of the layering of building of thin sympathy. So there's the local level, there is the regional level, there is the national level. And I think perhaps the most important of the three will be the local level, which touches on contact with the grassroots and how to mobilize sentiments or support among this group for the transitional justice interventions that we want to have. We want to get their buy-in. And so I think the start would be trying to build, but how long and how well this may take may be a bit of challenge. Also, to just touch on the Nigeria, because Lawan mentioned the Nigerian context, I would like to also say that our own experience of the civil that you mentioned did not have to do with, there wasn't any proper transitional justice engagement post-war. And I give my reasons for this. So the first attempt was by the military president, General Yakubu Gowon, who is still very much around, who declared the no victor, no vanquished situation, you know, which for me was more or less like an avoidance strategy of trying to like deal with the root causes or fundamental issues of these challenges. And when you discard people's experiences and their narratives, you know, by our own state imposition, then it becomes very difficult for people who have been aggrieved for 3 years of difficult living context to be able to manage this. Then the second one I wanted to touch on was Professor Chief Olusegun Obasanjo's intervention, when he had to talk about the Yorubas have offended the Igbos have offended the Hausas, the Hausas have offended the Shekirizis, and so he apologized on behalf of all these people, you know, and that was how he managed the Human Rights Violations Investigation Commission in the country at the moment. So we didn't treat our own context very, very well. So do we have any other further questions? Please, could you, I think there is a message in the chat. Is that just a comment? I agree with majority of the views. However, I'm skeptical on the view of thin sympathy as I come from Armenian background. Although TJ has not been used officially to the Armenian genocide, nonetheless, my thesis was on this theme. This is on how to involve victims to a common ground. So I think the question that is coming from Lara, if I hope I got the pronunciation correctly, is to say that how do we bring victims together who have different experiences perhaps on the opposing side? How do we bring them together to be able to make these interventions? Professor Wimberhouse, yeah, you can go, please.
You know, I think this comes back to, Professor King had mentioned this concept of a tipping point. The big question is, how do we know when that is, and how can we move in that direction? I think it's probably inevitable that there are going to be divisions among victims on the best path forward. My gut sense is that probably efforts to develop thin sympathy, at least as a concerted strategy to create a ripe condition for transitional justice, is probably going to start from victims and survivors. It's probably not going to come from what Dr. Quinn refers to as the unaffected population. So there probably needs to be some faction of the victim survivor population that starts this process. That's totally data-free conclusion, but my hunch on what would go on. I'm less certain that one would need to have any portion of the perpetrator population engaged, though it certainly would be helpful. And if we look at examples around the world, there often seems to be some perpetrators who feel a sense of regret, or for a variety of reasons decide that they should engage in addressing the past rather than trying to leave it behind. So, I think it's possible and probable that efforts to develop thin sympathy and ultimately transitional justice processes are going to happen with opposition from some segments of victims and perpetrator populations. But it wouldn't preclude success. I guess, to wrap up my thought there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Professor King.
Yeah, thank you. If I may add just a little bit in response to Lara's question, if I read in the chat when you say that you're skeptical on the view of thin sympathy, I don't know if it's fair to say that echoes some of the things I was thinking when I was saying it's both an appealing concept because it's not as difficult to envision as, say, deep empathy or forgiveness, but it's still pretty hard. Right? If you look at the words that Professor Quinn uses in her book, understanding the basic fact of the other's suffering, right? That's already quite a high bar to get to in a deeply divided society. And she uses words like recognition and appreciation of the facts, right? So I would concur with you that that's not so easy as maybe we're trying to make it sound when we're thinking about this multiplicity of interventions that might help us achieve it. And then just the second part of my answer would be to say that I think it's really important to involve victims and perhaps perpetrators as well. And I don't think, though, that the goal is to come to one national narrative. And this is something that Mr. Olayuku, you raised a little bit earlier, is that I think that there is space for a multiplicity of different stories, but some kind of common ground, right? The terminology that Lara is using in her question. And so, in Rwanda, for instance, in my research, they have come to one univocal narrative from which very little deviation is permitted. And a lot of people with whom I spoke felt excluded from that and wanted their stories to be heard. And I wonder, might there be a way, acknowledging that not all truths are equal, but to find some kind of common ground, understanding that there are going to be different perspectives.
Yeah, Professor King, I think I align with that to say that there can't be an objective truth, but we have to reach a common ground to move forward. I'm not thinking of thin sympathy as an ideal situation where both the scars would just fade off. Of course, there are going to be scars, but it's how we process it. When we talk about, for instance, let's look at the South African example of bringing down monuments, and when monuments are even being destroyed because of the memory. So what stimulates my interest in these actions is the fact that these monuments have been there for ages. People have gone there to snap pictures. People have gone there to revere these monuments. But over time, or based on the current situation, the experiential context of these specific societies, these monuments have had their meanings changed. So you see somebody, in a matter of days or matter of weeks, being transformed from a hero into a villain, because the interpretation of these memory initiatives, and that is why I think the concept of thin sympathy is a bit important. I'm saying that if we get people to understand that, okay, this is where we are at the moment, this is how we have to process, this experience that we are having or we've had in the past, then people can understand that when initiatives such as some memory initiatives are being, are being made, then they could know the reasons for them. So it's not about building status, it's not about creating days for memorials, but it's about the understanding that the population have of these kinds of initiatives. which when they become, of course, they can't be accepted to all societies, because someone's hero is going to be a villain in another society based on this, what side of the divide you are on. But if we come together, you know, with an understanding to say that, okay, this is how we want to process this, which I think is the very foundation of what Sympathy try to touch on, then we can now decide to move forward. It's not going to be an ideal situation. We should aspire to the ideal, but we should not expect that we're going to have the ideal from this scratch. And that's why we're talking about the long process, and how, other than looking for external funding or people that are disinterested in what actually happens in the society, you could look inwards and provide initiatives to even fund some of these interventions, because these are people that are more or less part of the process and perhaps have some primordial attachment to the societies in which they're trying to make these interventions. There's a very important aspect from ATA, which I think also is relevant to what's happening in the world at the moment. I'll be shocked if we are not making reference to what's happening in Ukraine, you know, which is also being processed, you know. So Putin is coming out to say that he is going on a peacekeeping mission, you know, to liberate a part of Ukraine that has been under perhaps right-wing nationalists, you know, or nationalistic sentiments who he regards as terrorists. That's his own narrative of it, you know. But Ukrainians are seeing an invasion of their fatherland, and they're going to defend it with all that they have. And she's telling us about that. Perhaps she would like to also speak. I would love to hear her own idea about this, because I think this also goes to the historical basis. So if you read about the Ukrainian crisis, you see a lot of people trying to disconstruct or deny Putin's own version of history, which goes back to the rules, the days of the empire, and how these are one and the same people, you know, who, you know, eventually became divided over time. And people are saying that this annexation is something that is imperial and is outdated. So how do we process this? Because this is also part of, you know, trying to understand a part of history to get people to work together. Of course, there's an option for dialogue, but I think it's also fundamental that things like this are addressed if we're even going to cultivate something of thin sympathy with somebody like Putin, you know, bringing him to the dialogue table and saying that, okay, what version of history do you have? What's your primordial attachment to these people? Can you kill the same people that you say you are brothers together? You know, so we'd like to have your own. I don't know if Atta wants to speak. I would love to have our own idea to elaborate more on this, or we just give the floor to our panelists.
Thank you. I will give floor to panelists because I haven't formulated my opinion on this yet. But hearing the ideas of Professor Quinn and then elaborated by the panelists, this idea came to me because lately I've been thinking about that. Where was our problem? Did we do something wrong those 25 years ago, not making like a common discourse, common understanding of what was wrong with Soviet Union? Like those Russian people who were brought here in Latvia, some of them, like quite a huge part, like considerable part, wouldn't say huge, but they think that the Soviet Union was good. They are in line with Putin's speech in Munich, saying that it was a great loss, this breaking up of Soviet Union. And so I think the fact that we did not do anything to create this common understanding, some thin sympathy of those non-Latvians who are living in Latvia about what Latvians went through during those 50 years. Maybe that's also a problem we see right now when people should take sides, like pro-Ukraine or pro-Russia, which is like really a problem right now here in Latvia. We're almost neighboring Ukraine. But yes, I think I still have to think a little bit about that. And if you have any comments on that, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Atta. So Professor King, do you want to go first?
So wasn't Joanna Quinn supposed to be here and answer all the tough questions? How did this happen? All right. Well, thank you, Arta, for this opening this range of conversation. Not an answer so much to say that I did just read a really interesting article in The Atlantic that got at some of the issues that you're talking about, and I'd be happy to send it afterwards. But it did, raise a few things that I want to raise in response to your question. And one, you're saying, a question of timing. Should we have done something X number of years ago? And just recapping what has been such a common theme in our conversation, that these processes take a long time. I'm reading from the article here, and I quote, "At the end of World War II, most Germans saw themselves not as perpetrators, but as victims of the Nazi leadership and of Allied bombings. Only the war crimes trials at Nuremberg, which revealed the full horror of the Holocaust, and then decades of cultural and educational interventions changed that." So just a parallel there to think about timing and sequencing and this really long-term cultivation of thin sympathy that I think we're talking about. And then, two other little tidbits in thinking about Russia and Ukraine, from which I have to emphasize I am so far from an expert. I am, just an observer trying to learn from others. But one is, right, the power of social media here. And we've talked about the words influencers, and we've also talked about digital access to information, the age of information dissemination. And so that's really interesting in thinking about its power for both negative mobilization and what I'm trying to look at, not in the context necessarily of Ukraine, but in a future project, is that its potential to harness it for good and for peace. And then maybe the last piece to say in response to your question that was just thought-provoking, so not an answer, is also to think about the power of individuals. So much has been written about Zelensky and his power of sort of connecting with individuals and his ability to try to find empathy among key populations. And I say this, with no judgment, but looking at, strategies that have been deployed, and for us to think about them in this thin sympathetic context.
Yeah, I actually enjoy Zelensky, and I think there's something with being an actor and also, ruling a nation. Perhaps we should start looking towards that direction. Professor Eric, please.
Yes, what I initially found is striking about Arta's comment was getting us to think about how strategies for developing thin sympathy will be different in different contexts, which is stating the obvious, but just on a basic level, that our approaches will probably be different if we're dealing with a conflict or dealing with a situation in which we have people from groups that are or were in conflict with each other, that they continue to live side by side. And then we have other contexts where there are either new borders that get created, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, or through ethnic cleansing, that largely these different groups don't live together much anymore. And so just want to raise the point again, which may seem obvious, that the strategies to develop thin sympathy would be different, or likely need to be different in those contexts. And thinking about the example, I'd like to throw another layer of complication onto it. Like in the example of Latvia, as Arta had mentioned, that you have these things happening both things happening at the same time. And so there are these different narratives that cross borders, but then there's also sizable, population in Latvia that identifies as Russian, and so it's simultaneously a domestic issue and an international issue at the same time. When it comes to the international side, I wonder to what extent, and I don't know if Professor King would want, as someone who looks more at education, want to weigh in on this, but it evokes to me these these examples where South Korea and Japan and Germany and Poland have created these bodies to kind of develop a common history that would inform curriculum in both of the countries.
Yeah, thank you very much for that wonderful intervention. I know this conversation, we're like far behind schedule. We're supposed to end at 4:30. So let me just use this opportunity to thank our author in absentia, Professor Quinn. Personally, you know, I used to know her as a graduate student during my doctoral program in UI, and for the wonderful interest that she's had then, and also reconnecting with her, you know, years later, just last year, and how she's been very supportive to the center, and also agreeing for us to, you know, make this speech to explore our book, you know, during one of our authors spotlight events. We're grateful to her. We thank Professor King for her own very important intervention as well, you know, stimulating our thoughts with our own observations, and also Professor Eric Welberhaus-Brown for this wonderful intervention. And of course, to our participants, without which we wouldn't even have made any success of this. We apologize for the initial technical issues. I think we've come out better than when we started the program in terms of our experience of how to implement, in terms of our knowledge of how to implement transitional justice, and how to better keep this conversation going in order to make sustainable interventions. We're going to have a special roundtable next month on age and economics, and how this translates to transitional justice interventions. We hope that you'll be able to join us, you know, when we disseminate our information. Thank you very much, and I wish everyone the very best, you know, for the rest of the day, and hope that you're going to be with us when next, you know, we call on you. Thank you very much. And I promise that we'll make every effort to make sure that Professor Quinn returns here to answer some of these questions, perhaps during a distinguished personality lecture, you know, sometimes in the future. And also, on behalf of all of us, we wish her safe and speedy recovery, and hope to see her back to full speed very soon. So thank you very much, everyone, and have the all the very best for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for a great conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.